Saw. So hello, welcome. For those who are listening in, I'm Rivera Sun. I am the program coordinator for Pache y Bene's Campaign Nonviolence and Nonviolent Cities program. And so Pache Bene, as most of us know on this call, but in case you're new, is a 30-year-old nonviolence organization that organizes an annual week of actions to build a culture of peace and active nonviolence, free from war, poverty, racism, environmental destruction, and the epidemic of violence. It's a very broad mission. A lot of people can work with us, and we work with a lot of people. Tonight is the first of a series of monthly skill building webinars in which we'll be exploring different themes about how to make our actions very powerful, very meaningful, and maybe even a little fun along the way, if at all possible. So I will be sharing the lineup of upcoming webinars in the chat box later on. But for now, I just want to invite us to take a deep breath and let ourselves come fully present. And remember with your out breath what brings you to this gathering today. Maybe breathing in a sense of solidarity with all those on the call and all those listening later. And breathing out a sense of connection to all those working for justice all over the world, in our communities, in our close circles, and in our 6 degrees of separation. They make us stronger, and we make them stronger in our interconnectedness. So tonight, because we're a small group, I want to just give us a chance to introduce ourselves briefly and say your name, where you're from, and what you hope to get out of this evening's session. And Kathy, you're off mute. Would you like to start?
Sure. I'm Kathy Neese, and right now I live in Nebraska. I grew up here. Spent about a bunch of years out in the Bay Area, out in California, which is how I first got hooked up with Pache Bene and learned how to do nonviolence training probably a couple decades ago now. Then we moved to Nebraska, and now I'm on the board for Nebraskans for Peace. And there's not a lot of peace work going on in the state. So I got on the board a couple years ago and was starting to get everybody excited about doing nonviolence training. And then we were just starting to try to formulate a plan. And then the pandemic came, and all of a sudden we couldn't go out and go to communities and meet people one-on-one with relational stuff and do all that. So I've been kind of sitting here trying to figure out. So I love that there's you're doing a lot of offerings, even more this year, that I feel like I can learn how to do some of this stuff online, like doing meetings, because I'm not a technology whiz in any way, shape, or form. So it's like all this new stuff. So I'm hoping to pick up ways to connect. There's different people around the state that are interested. So I'm not trying to do like a statewide thing, but I want to get little pockets going on things, so
Great.
Always looking for tips and that kind of stuff. So
great. Well, thank you. I think we'll cover a bunch of things that might be helpful.
Great.
Let's go over to Peter. You want to chime in? Just in brief, name, where you're at, and what brought you to the call this evening.
Peter Klotz Chamberlain. He is in original Awaswas-Mamutsun territory, Santa Cruz, California, Resource Center for Nonviolence. And I'm always wanting to learn more, not only from Rivera, but from everybody on, community organizing, building what we do and our impacts. And I'm happy to work with Muna on anti-racism education.
Great, wonderful. Muna, I think you're still driving, so maybe when you're ready to just come in and introduce yourself, that'd be great, but I'll go around the circle first. Robin, how about we hear from you?
Yeah, I'm Robin Morrison. My husband and I are both retired Methodist clergy, and we practice, or we're learning to practice permaculture. So we are practicing it, right, on our property. And I interned with Pache Bene when I was in seminary, 2005. 2006 and 7 and 8, those years back then, and moved to areas where there wasn't really people teaching or learning nonviolence. I'm back in Montana, and we just really made a switch politically, and it's so I'm just looking for ideas for maybe very stealth, safe but powerful ways to engage, because it's pretty risky right now. Will be for a while.
Yeah. Okay, great. Good to know. We certainly, I'm going to flag things that we could cover also in other webinars as well. Things like dispersed actions, which tend to be safer, stealth mode. I love that. I love doing nonviolent actions in stealth mode, or in ways that are like almost masquerading under the values of the person that I'm speaking to, in a way that makes them go, whoa, I never thought about that issue that way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so definitely we'll keep our eye out for moments to talk about that. Thanks, Robin.
Okay.
Michael, will you introduce yourself?
Pleasure. Michael Harrington. I'm from Austin, Texas, but I currently am in Seattle, Washington on an extended visit of 20 years. And so my every day I'm in Austin right here. I am, as Rivera said, I am one of her biggest fans because I work with young people, and her notion of the dandelion insurrection to me is prophetic, not just fictional. It is actually happening, and it needs resources. It needs elders to resource them and to hold them and to give them access. And that's why I'm on any call at any given day of the night. I'm listening for the prophetic word. Glad to be with y'all.
Great, thank you, Michael. Muna, if you can come off mute and just say hi, but if not, that's fine. Whenever you're ready, we'll just let you chime in and introduce yourself. Okay, still in transit, sounds like. Great, so let me just share my screen briefly, and I'll kind of give a little, very short recap of why this call now in Pache Bene's organizing efforts. So we actually launched the movement for a culture of nonviolence in 2014, I believe, and we are now in all 50 states and about 30 countries. And the movement has grown tremendously. We started with 400 actions, which we thought was really rocking and rolling in the first year, to now we're up to 4,000 actions. And one thing that we're noticing is that some people do large actions really well, and some people do small actions really well. But we know from the work of Erica Chenoweth and Maria Steffen, who did a really important study on nonviolent struggle in 2011 or 2013, that one of the things that makes nonviolent movements tick, makes them work and succeed, is participation. And the ways that we participate in movements actually make a difference. So with acts of protest and persuasion, we know that we can move the dial on how people feel about an issue, what they think about a proposed solution, their understanding of the complexity of a problem in our world, and their favorability towards a resolution to the conflict. We also know that a lot of struggles don't succeed until we start to non-cooperate with the system of injustice and intervene in the operation of the system of injustice. But all of these things require participation. And Erica and Maria identified that while they couldn't say how few people it took to succeed in nonviolent struggle, they did notice that every campaign they studied that mobilized 3.5% of the populace always won its struggle. Always. Now, in the United States, that's about 11 million people, roughly, if we include children, which I think we always should include children. So that should just give us a little sense of why size and scope matters, why it's important to think about building participation in our movements. And so tonight we're going to look at a large array of ways that we can work to build participation, work to build both general participation, but also certain types of specific groups involved in our movements, key allies, key people that we might need to sway or persuade to take certain actions so our movement can succeed. But I'm going to start actually with a video. Hold on, I'm just going to set it up. And because this is one of the best videos that I have ever seen about how to start a movement. And it's really short. It's only two and a half minutes.
Yeah.
Here we go. Let me just get this going. Can you guys hear this?
No.
Okay. Let's see if we can get that working. You're doing so great, tech-wise. Just stop share and set it up again. Ah, the little button did not get clicked. So that's a life lesson on organizing. If at first you don't succeed, try again. Nope. And let your computer. How's that?
So ladies and gentlemen, at TED, we talk a lot about leadership and how to make a movement. Watch a movement happen, start to finish, in under 3 minutes and dissect some lessons from it. First, of course you know, a leader needs the guts to stand out and be ridiculed. But what he's doing is so easy to follow. So here's his first follower with a crucial role. He's going to show everyone else how to follow. Now notice that the leader embraces him as an equal. So now it's not about the leader anymore, it's about them, plural. Now there he is calling to his friends. Now if you notice that the first follower is actually an underestimated form of leadership in itself. It takes guts to stand out like that. The first follower is what transforms a lone nut into a leader. And here comes a second follower. Now it's not a lone nut, it's not two nuts, 3 is a crowd, and a crowd is news. So a movement must be public. It's important to show not just the leader, but the followers, because you find that new followers emulate the followers, not the leader. Now here come 2 more people, and immediately after, 3 more people. Now we've got momentum. This is the tipping point. Now we've got a movement. So, notice that as more people join in, it's less risky. So those that were sitting on the fence before now have no reason not to. They won't stand out, they won't be ridiculed, but they will be part of the in crowd if they hurry. So, over the next minute, you'll see all of the those that prefer to stick with the crowd, because eventually they would be ridiculed for not joining in. And that's how you make a movement. But let's recap some lessons from this. So first, if you are the type like the shirtless dancing guy that is standing alone. Remember the importance of nurturing your first few followers as equals. So it's clearly about the movement, not you. Okay, but we might have missed the real lesson here. The biggest lesson, if you noticed, did you catch it? Is that leadership is over-glorified. That yes, it was the shirtless guy was first, and he'll get all the credit, but it was really the first follower that transformed the lone nut into a leader. So as we're told that we should all be leaders, that would be really ineffective. If you really care about starting a movement, have the courage to follow and show others how to follow. And when you find a lone nut doing something great, have the guts to be the first one to stand up and join in. And what a perfect place to do that, TED. Thanks.
All right. I love that, how to build a movement. I mean, how funny is that? Have you ever been the lone shirtless, well, maybe not shirtless, the lone nut dancing away? I mean, I have all the time. No problems there. Have you ever been the second person who has joined in? I would imagine, as many of you are long-term activists, you've had that experience, right? You're an early supporter of a cause that may not have even broken to national or even local attention yet, right? If you are at a peace and justice center, you often are playing that role in your community. Someone comes to you with a problem, you're probably one of the first groups to say, yeah, let's organize an event around this. Anyone been, part of the first wave of people joining into something? Yeah, so, there's a couple demonstrations happening here or there, and you're like, I'm definitely going. Have you ever been part of a huge rush of a crowd joining into a movement? A mass action. Yeah. Can we, yeah, go ahead.
Organized one or one that was spontaneous?
Either.
No, I've been part of an organized one, but.
Great, yeah. So let's just popcorn style come off mute. Think about the times that you have been part of a larger scale action, whether it's large for your local community or it's large for the nation. What was it that compelled you to take action? And we can just put aside the worthiness of the cause, because I trust that you all use that quality. I mean, although maybe you just joined the rave party in the streets too, I don't know. But what was it that got you into action? Was it someone talking to you? Was it, a flyer you saw? What are those things?
Accessibility was a big bit. You know where to go and how easy it is to show up for it.
The egregiousness of whatever the movement starters were addressing.
In California nuclear power movements, the success and nonviolent success of people in Germany and New England, and just like that was a clear, concrete example and inspiration.
Well, I did it because I trusted Bene. It was Ken Buddigan and Veronica and other Ken, Preston Pyle at the time, and Louis and Peter, and I trusted them, and they taught me. So I was more of a strategist, kind of change the world through legislation and politics until my experience with Bene.
Most recently, I mean, the biggest one recently, when the Women's March, after, the very first one that happened in after the inauguration, and there are millions of people everywhere, it wasn't anything I would have thought of doing, being here in Nebraska or anything. And then all of a sudden, everybody was in the streets, and that's nothing you normally see in Nebraska. So, and they're still doing it every year. They just had one this last weekend, a lot smaller this time, but that's what really pushed me out there. It's like, okay,
Yeah. Oh, you guys are already on it. Listen to this list. It's that stories that tell you, you can, that the plan can succeed. Very important, whether it's a good strategy that you're like, yeah, that'll work, or it's like, oh, they made this crazy idea work in Germany. Okay, let's try it. Trust in the organization calling you to action can often be a really big deal in whether or not somebody will come and join. Do you know who's organizing, right? Do you feel like they have a moral authority in your community or a sense of integrity in what they do? Accessibility, and that can be a lot of different things, right? So can your whole family come, right? Can women come? Can people of differing abilities come? Can people of different ages come? And is that clear and explicit in the organizing materials? Or conversely, if it's not safe for certain groups to come to this action, what else can they do? What is another type of action, right? That came up also with the multinodal. So if you can't go to DC, which is often a big accessibility action for economic issues and work schedules and parenting and responsibilities that people have, is there a multinodal action happening nearby? Right. So the Women's March, the one in DC, was only like 1 or 2 million people, but the one sorry, it was a really big deal. But the ones all over the world added up to 4 million people, right? So it doubled the size of the action. Things like clarity of communication, who, what, where, when, why, how can you participate? And then, is it a burning issue, right? And we're going to talk a little bit more about burning issues and how little Kindle sparks can suddenly blaze up. I want to just pause for a second because those were all so great. You already know so much about what really gets us into action, right? And I think sometimes the question is just applying it to the work that we're doing. How do we frame the issue that we're working on? How do we announce the issue that we're working on? How do we talk to people about the event that we're calling them to in a way that ticks all those boxes off, right? And then how do we repeat the call to action as critical mass builds, right? So, when you get an important person in your community to say, yeah, I'll be there, how do you let people know, hey, Reverend so-and-so is going to be there? Or, if you happen to live where Rosa Parks did, or Dolores Huerta, they're going to be there. Because suddenly more people will be like, oh, I think maybe I should be there too, right? And not just super famous people that we all know, but people in our community that we really respect. This can also go for people who may be more middle of the road on their political perspective, but can join with you as an odd bedfellow on this issue. We'll kind of revisit that in a minute. So yeah, so much wisdom in this group already. Peter and Muna, do you want to introduce yourselves a little? I know you had to pop in a little bit late, so I just want to let you say who you are, where you're calling from, and what brought you to the call today.
Sure. Thank you, Rivera. This is Muna, everyone. Good evening. She, her, calling from the Santa Cruz Mountains, the land of Amamutsan and the Ohlone people. I work with Peter at the Resource Center for Nonviolence in Santa Cruz on anti-racism programs and book circles. I came across actually Pache Bene just last year, Rivera, and I was very impressed by your work and respected what you did, especially last year. So I'm happy to be part of this training, especially that I'm passionate always about adding more tools and skills to my toolbox when it comes to centered, really like consciousness centered social and peace activism and nonviolent training. That's it, I guess, from my part. Thank you for having me. And hi, Peter. Hi, everyone.
2 Peters on the call. That was nice. Peter Anderson was like, hi.
There's 2 of us. Yeah, so my name is Peter Anderson. I am in Minneapolis. I work with an organization called Peace Catalyst International, doing kind of community grassroots peace building work. And kind of as we shift further out of the pandemic, I'm interested in kind of how do I build up capacity for drawing churches and white folk into doing anti-racist work in our community. So.
Awesome, thank you. It's great to hear this. So I'm going to share 4 stories from the amazing canon of nonviolent struggles. And there are so many stories we could tell, but I'm just going to share 4 of them tonight. They each model a different way of building participation and momentum in a movement. Some of them will be familiar, and some of them maybe not so much. So I'm going to share my screen because I like pictures. I like to show the people that we're talking about. We're talking about them. So this is a pretty well-known campaign, but this is Gandhi's 1930 Salt March. But, you know, one of the things about Gandhi is that he was actually really genius at promotion. I mean, nobody really thinks about Gandhi as like a marketer, but he was actually very skillful in that way. And the Salt March is a great example of that. The year before, Gandhi was tasked by the Indian National Congress to come up with the campaign that everyone in India could do to build the self-rule movement and to build a sense of we are willing to resist the British Empire to regain our sovereignty. And Gandhi went away and talked to people and thought about it. And what he came up with was salt. And when he said this to the Indian National Congress people, they were all like, salt? What? What are you talking about? Salt? And he said, yes, because the average Indian feels that the salt monopoly held by the British is odious. They literally called it the odious salt laws. And so people couldn't make salt, which was really important. It was like not being able to have a refrigerator in today's world, right? So imagine that the US government said, you can't have a refrigerator, right? Unless you pay us fees that you can't afford. Well, everybody would be mad about that. They'd be like, my vegetables are rotting, my cheese is going bad, I can't keep ice cream around for my kids, or whatever it is. So this was what was going on in Gandhi's time around salt, which was a key preservative. And so when he said salt, he had to explain it to all his colleagues. But when they got it and they decided to launch the salt campaign, they had a little problem, which is that, you know, they knew about it, but the 250 million other Indians didn't necessarily know that Gandhi was going to take on the Salt March, take on the salt laws. So he organized a march with 78 of his key buddies who were studying nonviolence at the ashram that he had set up. And they decided to march to the sea. And that's usually the way, if you hear this story, you hear it told, that Gandhi marched to the sea. But no, actually Gandhi marched from village to village to village to village to village. And in every village, they stopped and they talked about why salt, why now, why we're going to resist. Here's what's going to happen. Are you ready to join us? And they'd pick up a few more followers along the way. So by the time they got to the sea, after all these short little marches and rallies and teach-ins and trainings, there were 10,000 people with Gandhi when he reached the ocean. And when he reached down and picked up that handful of salt and seawater and mud, he was doing an individual act of civil disobedience to the salt laws. But when the 9,999 other Indians with him did it, they were now doing mass civil disobedience to the point where the salt laws were unenforceable by the British, causing them ultimately, to make a longer story short, to have to overturn the salt laws. But if you see in this story, in the way that I told it, this is actually a story of building participation step by step, from Gandhi to the Indian National Congress, who lent their moral authority to the issue, to his key colleagues at the ashram, to the villagers who joined in, to the 10,000 people that certainly got reported upon, to then millions of Indians all over the country making, selling, and buying salt in defiance of the British salt laws. But one of the things about this campaign that was really significant that we rarely hear the narrative of is that the SALT campaign mobilized a lot of women in India who had previously not been as active in Gandhi's campaigns. But this was a way that they could participate in the self-rule movement. And indeed, this was one of the major turning points of this campaign. So this is why I say Gandhi was actually a pretty genius promoter. Another piece of the story that we don't often tell is that Gandhi actually ran the world's largest circulation newspaper at the time. The Young India actually had more readers than any other newspaper in the world. Pretty amazing when you think about that. So the second story I want to tell is about the Baltic Way in 1989. Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia were all part of the Soviet Union. And this had happened after World War II. A couple of them had had actually violent armed struggles trying to regain their sovereignty at multiple points in their more recent history. It gets a little complicated, but I'll shorten the story. But at one point, the independence movements decided they would gather as many people as they could and try to make 1,000-mile long human chain from the north part of the country, the three countries, all the way to the south, spanning the three countries. And this was called the Baltic Way. And it was a symbol that the three countries were united in wanting their independence from the Soviet regime. And indeed, within a year to 2 years, all three of them, through nonviolent struggle, won their independence. The third story I want to talk about is the Women of Liberia Mass Action for Peace. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to go back one moment, finish this story. So one of the things to think about in this story is that this was a bold, audacious action. It was kind of a crazy idea. Like, can we cover 1,000 miles with people? Right? Think about how much direct organizing it would have taken to get these moms and grandmoms, the kids, the teenagers to say, yeah, we'll go to this section of the road and we'll stand and we'll link arms. How much direct organizing, talking to one another had to happen to pull this off. So the third story is the Women of Liberia Mass Action for Peace. And this happened recently in 2013. I believe. I might be off a year. So this was during the second civil war in Liberia. They'd just been through the first civil war. It was horrifically bloody. And as the second civil war started to break out, Lima Gaboe had a dream actually that said that God came to her and said, gather the women and pray for peace. Gather the women and pray for peace. So she knew from the dream that she had to go to the Muslim women and the Christian women, and they had to gather together every single day and pray in a public space for peace. And there's a lot of components to this story, but there's a fabulous documentary called Pray the Devil Back to Hell about it. So I'm not going to tell you the whole story. I'll jump to the end. They stopped the second civil war. They get the men to agree to a peace deal. And ultimately, they actually get their dictator, Charles Taylor, to resign. And one of the core organizers actually became the first female president of Liberia. So one of the things that's working for them in how they're organizing participation is that they're specifically going to two groups, Christian women and Muslim women, and saying, we must come together to take a stand for peace. So sometimes choosing and targeting who is going to be your first adopters can help you start to mobilize that critical mass that pulls other people into action. The last story I want to tell is the India's 2019 the CCA law was a discriminatory law against giving Muslims citizenship. It went along with a bunch of other laws that were also heavily disliked by many Indians. It was seen as part of the Modi government's kind of crackdown on civil liberties. So this is actually, at the time in 2019, this was the world's largest protest in history. There were 250 million people involved in this protest. And actually, they just broke that record again with the recent farmer protests that happened. But one of the ways that they pulled off this many people is by working with institutions, school districts, women's groups, industry coalitions, unions. And actually, Jean Sharp, who is a scholar of nonviolent struggle, said, we often overlook that if we organize the institutions, we organize the people along with them. So sometimes thinking about not just how can I talk to individual people, but how can I talk to institutions and groups and ask them to take collective action on behalf of a cause. So I'm going to pause there. Those are just 3 of the many stories that we could tell about how to build participation. If you look at every successful nonviolent movement, you find some shared ways that they built participation and some really unique ways that they mobilize people, all of which we can learn from. So what are your thoughts, questions, comments, or reflections at this point? Just feel free to come off mute and share. Was there a particular approach that you were like, ooh, I haven't thought about that one for a while?
So in my culture and in my environment, the last one, working with institution groups and stuff, because that is an existing infrastructure here in Montana. They up until the takeover of the state, but we have an organization called the Montana Human Rights Network that I approached many times about nonviolence training, and they just brushed me off. And they're going through a shift in organization. So, but it would take people being able to imagine something different than they've been doing it in the past. That's the issue, is that some of that's been happening. It's not like we're building nonviolence from nothing. We are just dealing with a much stronger force on the other side right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no one said it was easy, right?
No.
So we can tell these stories in hindsight, like, wow, Gandhi went on a march and ooh, everybody started making salts, right? But we did get to skip over the parts where you had to have a lot of long, boring meeting conversations with the Indian National Congress and, the naysayers who wrote letters to the editor about how stupid the SALT campaign was and how people told them it would never work and how this group and that group were like, I'm not joining the silly SALT campaign, right? We get to kind of gloss over that in hindsight, but definitely there are barriers to why groups and organizations won't adopt a strategy or tactic. And sometimes we have to work around them, sometimes we can't work with them, and sometimes we really need to think about those barriers and be like, how can I meet their needs? What is it that they're needing that's holding them back? Maybe they're afraid of getting overcommitted. Maybe they aren't prepared to take on a risky action. Maybe they're worried about alienating some of their people on an issue. All of those are valid.
They haven't been shifting the public opinion. They haven't been getting the shift in consciousness. Doing what we've been doing. We're not making progress. So,
yeah. Other thoughts from folks?
I'll chime in. I don't know if this is like a big or impossible for me even to grasp, but I'm gonna just think out loud with you guys, dreaming of the impossible. Just having heard what cases you presented to us, Rivera, I'm thinking, okay, what is that thing that will unite Republicans and Democrats, just one thing in this country, and get as many Americans together all across the board, religiously and politically, to do for the good of this country and whoever is impacted by this country. That's just, this question is just throbbing in my head right now, and I thought to share it with you out loud. Speaking of what unite people to have more masses to make change in a cause. Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes you need to look for those common ground campaigns before you work on the more button pushing campaign, right? So I had a really good example up my sleeve just a second ago, but it flew out of my head. I want to say it was a fracking campaign where they actually had to work on water scarcity for the ranchers before they then could build on that to do anti-fracking work, right? Meeting the needs of those who are opposed to the campaign that the lefties in the area wanted to work on. So then also another example is up in northern Wisconsin. There was a 1970s, 80s era campaign to assert indigenous treaty rights to hunt, fish, and gather on unceded territory. This was hugely controversial. The locals who like to hunt and fish, whose land they felt it actually was, literally tried to shoot them when they were out spearfishing at night. But they persisted for this nonviolent campaign, and they actually ultimately won that campaign. And they then had a whole series of campaigns around stopping mine openings. But the funny thing was, on one of those campaigns, the very people who they had been in conflict with around the treaty rights suddenly became their allies, because that treaty rights struggle had taught them that they were actually united around fishing. And now these fishers and hunters became their allies in stopping this. I think it was a copper mine. I could be wrong. It could be an iron mine. From polluting the wild rice beds and polluting the whole area where they all hunted and fished. So sometimes you got to think, you could step back a step, right? And say, how can we build some relationship and common ground before we even ask or try to take on this challenging thing?
It is relationship building, I feel, honestly, first, and finding commonality. I was listening to a podcast interview recently with Iko Bethia and Bene Brown. I don't know if you are aware of their work. And the statement they were repeating that really struck in my consciousness, that this work we're choosing to do, anti-racism, social justice, transformation, whatever, it's really relational rather than it's transactional. So it made me think about the relational aspect of, how can we come together and work together? Thank you.
Yeah, Peter K.
Yeah, I liked your word, direct organizing, I think is the way you said it, but basically talking to people as just key. I spent a lot of time devising plans, but it really is talking to people that's essential. And the example in Liberia, choosing who to talk to, I mean, really going, prioritizing and not just starting with our allies.
Yeah, looking beyond your usual choir. Well, we're going to talk a little bit about that next up. So I'd love to share with you 3 approaches to outreach that kind of build off of that direct organizing concept. And these are three more tools of approaches that are already in your toolbox, basically. We'll just review them. So the first style of doing outreach to build participation is open calls to action, right? General strike, May 1st, everybody, everywhere, right? Maybe one of the most famous and probably I could argue the most successful examples of this was actually the call to action that launched the Occupy movement, which started with this ad in Adbusters. But I would say, you know, when you think about that, Adbusters as a magazine reached the very first early adopters of the Occupy movement, the anti-capitalists, the anarchists, the anti-wealth crowd, which at the time was incredibly small. I mean, hardly anybody was talking about this stuff. And then what really made Occupy Wall Street succeed, and one of the funny things about it is that the people who occupied Zuccotti Park didn't expect to be as successful as that set of protests became. They really, I think, were taken aback a little bit when 400 to 800 Occupy encampments popped up like mushrooms all over the country. So for a movement that was actually incredibly not organized, it was incredibly successful in many ways. It certainly was successful in breaking the issue of the 1% and the problem of inequality to national attention, actually in ways that have not gone away, right? That have not lessened since the Occupy movement, but in fact grown actually more articulate, more nuanced, more intersectional, and more observant since then, which I think is pretty remarkable. So open calls can happen with posters. They can famously in the digital age, they happen with like Facebook invites, right? Digital calls to action. They may be emails and e-blasts. They may be general calls to action that are circulated through local networks. There's a number of formats that this can take. But the idea behind these is that they're very broad, they're very open, and anybody can show up, right? Which has both its power and it has some real challenges. For instance, if you're holding a mass demonstration and everybody's just showing up, you may have trouble maintaining nonviolent discipline, for example, because the people coming have maybe never even heard of nonviolence. They've never even thought about how to de-escalate or self-regulate. They may be really angry. They may be ready to throw things at cops or throw punches at counter-protesters, right? So open calls can sometimes really build a movement quickly, but it may be hard for your movement to achieve certain aspects of its goals. So the second kind of organizing that I want to talk about tonight is direct outreach and invitations. And, you know, one of the people who has a great quote about this is Cesar Chavez. And there's a story about 3 young organizers drove across California to come out to the farms and ask him, how do you organize? And he answered, well, first you talk to one person, then you talk to another person, and then you talk to another person. And they all laughed and they were like, no, really, Cesar, how do you organize? And he said, all right, I'll tell you how it really goes. First you talk to one person, then you talk to another person, then you talk to another person. So he was very serious of organizing happens because you reach out to people, you build relationship, you build connection. You know, a lot of labor organizing has really been built on this, often because people who are going to take action in the workplace, they're gonna run some substantial risks in doing that organizing. They may lose their job, they may lose wages, they may face industry bans, they may face violence, they may face legal lawsuits and legal repercussions. So that direct relationship and connection can be really important to helping people find the solidarity and sense of support that they need to take action. So another way to think about direct outreach and invitations is not just individual to individual, but as Lima Gabowi and the Women of Liberia's story was illuminating, from group to group, right? Think about some group in your community that has never taken part in an action, or you've never done something with them. And think about what it would be like to go and have a conversation with some of them and say, what would it take for us to work together? We're going to do this event. Do you want to be part of it? And what would that look like? What's coming up on your calendar? And maybe we should be there in support, in solidarity, right? Maybe this question is also something like, the school kids would love to take action, but they're going to need some TLC to get them there, right? We need to talk to the teachers. We need to talk with the parents. Maybe we need to go through the Boys and Girls Club. And that's what's going to be able to mobilize them into action. I find this style of organizing actually underutilized and really powerful when we tap into it. So this is a third kind of approach: crash the party and play to the crowd. So sometimes you think that you need to do all the mobilizing work yourself in order to have a successful action. But sometimes another group or organization will already have convened the crowd. And what you need to do is organize a really smart little action that can crash their party. And this is me and my friends on the 4th of July in our little local town, which gets about 1,000 people at its 4th of July parade. Now, 1,000 people doesn't sound like a lot to a big city, but let me tell you, when you have 6,000 people in your town, it's like a big to-do, right? So we literally jumped into this parade lineup to raise awareness about the migrant family separation at the border. And one of the things about this story is that my friend Danielle Escalante called me the night before and said, "This is happening. Will you stand with me?" And Danielle is a Chicanx. And I said, "Of course. If you ask me, I'll be there." So I made the signs, he made the rolling cart, I dressed up as the Statue of Liberty. But what we're doing at this action is not just raising awareness for the issue, because there's 3 other people you're not seeing in these photos. 2 of them have handouts for the demonstration happening the next week, and they're running up and down the crowd, handing them out to everybody. And the 3rd person you don't see is the person taking the photos. I think in the digital age, one of the most important persons to invite to your action is the person who's going to take the photos of your event and get them online. And I'll tell another story later on about why that can be, how powerful that can be. Are there any questions about these 3 approaches? There can be a lot more approaches, but these are 3 that you can really start to think about how they work differently and how you might be able to use them. Now, they're not mutually exclusive. You might be able to use all of the above. Raise your hand if you've ever done an open call for your event. Yeah. Especially post 2000, that, from 2000 to 2010, that actually became a predominant strategy of mobilizing and outreach. Part of that was because social media was so open in its organic reach algorithms that you literally could pop up a Facebook event and have hundreds of people showing up. But now, as the social media platforms have actually commercialized, your organic reach, what you're going to reach with your non-paid posts, has been squelched. You're not going to reach as many people organically. So that style of organizing is up against the commercial constraints of ad-based platforms, just so you know. How many of you have ever done direct outreach to individuals or groups? Some once, maybe not as often. Yeah, I'm thinking about doing more of that, honestly, because I think it's very powerful. Have you ever crashed the party? No, you should try it sometime. It's a blast. It's so much fun. I'll show you a photo later on of when we crashed the 4th of July parade the year before. Oh no, actually, that's not true. We actually entered the 4th of July parade. We did a demonstration for muckrakers, activists, and whistleblowers, where we had over 100 names of people who have really kind of rattled the US empire. And at the end of the parade, we were down at the end of the parade, and this official came running up to us And he was like, "You need to come back to the judge's tent right now." And I was like, "Oh shoot, I'm gonna get arrested or something, thrown out or something like that for my radical action." Actually, we won the $200 award for most patriotic, which allowed us to buy a lot of protest signs. So crash the party, have some fun. All right, I want to talk a little bit, and I thank you for listening and indulging me as I talk, but I want to talk a little bit about using art and creativity to build participation, because I think this is one of the most powerful ways to get people involved. So the first story I'm going to share, I'm just going to bring this up again, is actually a really important story because it inspired the action I just talked about, where we crashed the 4th of July parade. This is maybe one of the most powerful uses of art to build momentum for a movement. This is the sculpture that actually galvanized the entire explosion of this issue. It was like a non-issue for most Americans, even a lot of progressive groups. Then this sculpture, and there's nobody actually in there. It's really like a doll and a wig and a pair of shoes and a Mylar blanket. They set this up in 3 or 4 different cities, and the photos of these actually is what launched the major national attention on this critically important human rights issue. So sometimes art can do something that even a protest with 1 million people can't do. So this is a group in Oakland, or a couple of groups in Oakland, and they've done a number of these giant murals across the street. David Solnit is one of the architects of this particular crowd that's doing it. East Point Peace Academy has joined in. But the cool thing about this is not just that they needed like 50 to 100 people to paint this giant street mural, but that every single one of these circles was a specific invitation to another local group to add their solidarity message to the big banner of Choose Democracy, Stop a Coup. This was a model that they had test run with around climate action, I think during one of the youth climate strikes, maybe 3 or 4 months before, where they actually had 50 of these circles. But this is a great example of how art can be an excuse to reach out to groups and invite them to actively participate. Particularly if you don't necessarily have a great relationship with them, giving them space to join in is a really respectful way of creating a place where their message is welcome and where your common cause can link you together. This is my local action group. I'm going to tell a couple stories about this, but I want you to just notice, like, look at the photo and notice how many different ways people could come and participate in this action. We have 5 giant puppets, which actually were built by 2 local women and who have toured the US, but they wouldn't have carried them in the 4th of July parade because they're both getting older. And carrying these puppets is not on their high list of fun things to do anymore. So what they needed was me to organize myself and 4 other strong backs to carry the giant puppets. We also had room in the pace that we set for our friend who had broken her ankle recently, right? So differing mobilities had a place, differing ages had a place. People could carry banners and signs. So making sure people know that these kind of variations to your action are welcome can sometimes get them involved. Our local action group also outreached to a local school group to do a Earth Day parade. And in it, one of the teachers built this giant, they had gone and picked up all the trash and made a trash dragon out of it. And it literally took 2 parents and 10 kids to carry this thing through the streets. So we had an additional 30 people who came to our event. We also had a marching band, a brass band show up totally unexpectedly. I have no idea where they came from, but they were a lot of fun. One of the other things we've done really successfully locally is use some creativity and ridiculousness to actually get people involved. So this is our march against the against Monsanto march. And in Taos, literally you can just walk 6 blocks around the town. That's about all you march. So we don't do big marches really well, and you only see maybe 20 people on the street. So we decided that what we would do is we would do car caravans from one grocery store to the next, from one end of town to the other, and there's maybe 3 or 4 miles in between them. And we would march into the grocery stores dressed up as bees and corn and being chased by our Monsanto spraying farmer, and then beg the produce section guys to not stock GMO foods. This got a lot of participation because it was different. People never did that in our town. And because it was a little ballsy, actually, we found out that several of the grocery store chains didn't allow us to take photos of this, which we did anyway. We have some of those nice hand in the camera photos. So the last story I want to tell from our local action team about how to use art to build participation is to remember that art builds are some of the best ways to build participation in movements. One time when Israel was bombing Gaza, we decided to remake Guernica. And this is the famous art piece Guernica by Picasso about the bombing of Guernica. And instead of doing the typical Guernica, we replaced certain imagery with images that were coming out of Gaza at the time. And so what we did was I gave out a call to action and I said, I need a garage because I don't have a garage. I don't have anywhere to lay this out and paint this. And so my friend Rick said, you can do it in our garage. And I asked people to bring paint and paintbrushes, and there was about 10 of us involved in this art build. But one of the great things that happened was I had this little scrap of paper. That's all I had, this little sketch. And I looked at these giant banners, these bed sheets, and I had no idea how to blow it up. And one of the guys who was like, I'm not an artist at all, said, I'm an engineer. And here's how you do it. And he turned it into a graph and taught us how to use a graph to do a blow up of the imagery. So if I hadn't done art, I would never have known that this person was an engineer and actually had done this before for architecture and whatever, and gotten him involved in the project. But once we had this giant mirror banner, we also needed people to carry it. And once I put the photos out of building the banner, people all wanted to come to this demonstration and be with the giant banner. So we actually have about, I think there's 30 people in this demonstration, which again for Taos is a pretty large crowd. And we all wore black, we all put red on our hands and slowly lifted them up to say we've got blood on our hands. But there was one person who didn't want to be nonviolent at all. And so I asked her to do a special task. I said, will you bang the drum to give us a tempo for our marching around the plaza, for lifting up our hands. And when you go silent, we'll hold for the count of 10, and then we'll slowly lower our hands down again. So this was a way to build participation with someone who didn't have a nonviolence commitment at all, who was like, I'm gonna throw punches today. And she couldn't throw punches because she was too busy banging the drum. So just to share a few more stories, just to really get your juices flowing around how to use art and creativity to build participation. When Bene was going to honor the 70th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we knew that not everyone could come to Los Alamos to protest at the gates of where the bomb was built. So we asked people to fold paper cranes, and we said we want 70,000 paper cranes. 1,000 for every year of this tragedy. And we're like, yeah, we'll probably get 5,000. No, actually, we started getting people spread the word, and they started sending us cranes from all over the place. We had to rent a storage unit to store all these cranes. And we hung them up at the very location where the bomb was built in the middle of Los Alamos. We had shipments from Guatemala, we had shipments from Japan, of course, from Russia, from China. And it was a wonderful way to get people involved and have their energy be represented even if they couldn't come in person. This is another way to think about building participation in a creative way. So a lot of times, because of the time of day, because of work schedules, because of vulnerabilities, not everybody can be at our action. But you can use art to humanize them, to make them present in the space, like these elders actually in North Brooklyn have done with the youngers, these young people who are saying, I will not be sacrificed. So think about ways that you can use art to represent people who may not be able to come in person. This is another variation in Turkey at a climate strike during the pandemic lockdown. This is an installation by Ai Weiwei about migrants. And what you're looking at is, I think, 14,000 life jackets. And what I really love about this as an example of actions is that you feel both the presence and the absence of 14,000 people who are impacted by the refugee and climate refugee crisis. So think about ways that you can make present the people who are by geography or oppression rendered invisible, and how you can use something of scale like life jackets to show what's really going on. This is another variation of this. This is 20,000 chairs trying to represent just the scale of what actually at this point 200,000 deaths from COVID had meant. This is an interesting one. This is a wall of Trump's lies. And so instead of holding a demonstration at a specific time, they did an art installation where people in the street in the Bronx would just wander by and they would see color-coded all of Trump's 20,000 lies in the past 4 years. All right. I'm going to pause. So I hope that kind of sparked some ideas, made you think about building participation in slightly different ways. We often think about mass participation having to look a certain way, big demonstrations in street. Oftentimes that's not even the most powerful thing we can do, right? So as you're thinking about the work that you're doing, think about ways that you can really shake up how you're building that participation and what is meaningful participation in your movement. Sometimes it's not about being physically there in body. Sometimes it's about an action that people do, a way of sharing their story about what they're doing, a way of feeling connected to other people who are doing a similar action. And the list goes on. Questions, thoughts, or comments? All right.
I mean, the
So,
most quickly,
yeah,
the
go
most
ahead.
powerful to me was just thinking of ways to represent people who can't be there either because they want to be or because they're rendered invisible. That's great. And the related thing is, like, we have an art group in Santa Cruz that has curated some social justice art in the resource center. But I haven't thought that could be another invitation. I mean, they created their own kind of COVID memorial thing, but anyway, to think of them as a resource for some of these ideas is a good one.
You know who taught me that one, Peter, is actually Kathleen Crocetti. You must know Kathleen. So she, right around 2004, I think it must have been, because I was out of college, she was doing a project around the soldiers who had been killed in Iraq and Afghanistan, where she had all these little, like, kind of like gingerbread loaf-sized clay soldiers, like thousands of them, and she would set them up in places. And she always needed like 10 volunteers to try to set up these things for the day-long installation. So she was always doing outreach to people, being like, please come help me set these things up. We're going to do it at the Veterans Hall. We're going to do it in a school today. We're going to do it in the public park tomorrow. And it really showed me that she was making visible the things that we don't see on television anymore, the losses from war. but she was also engaging people around that.
Mhm.
And for those who don't know, Kathleen Crocetti is a local to Santa Cruz artist. Great. Did anyone else have something from what we've just talked about that was like, oh, that's powerful, that's
I
interesting?
want to second what you said, Peter, that installation art is brilliant, and it's, you know, I remember when the Adbusters folks did that first poster, and the life jackets made me remember so many other things that I've seen people do, large and small. The addition of art in any project is self-evident, and I'm just grateful to be reminded of it. I also just want to apologize because I have a student that's going to be ringing in on me to interrupt in a few minutes. So if I disappear, that's why. And it's been a blessing, as always, to be with you, Rivera, and to meet all you lovely folk.
Great.
So I just was thinking of something. I just throw it out, see if anybody's tried something like this. I know that Peter did something like this back in Las Vegas a while back, but we have some, in fact, between my daughter's house and my house, we're 3 miles apart, there's this church that's hosting the militia publicly, sending out flyers, that, and they're a group of people that, you know, like want to go back to Washington, D.C. and restore. I mean, it's part of you. It's just what you might imagine it being. And there are, we're aware of several churches who are kind of that have been taken over by that mentality. Has anybody organized groups of more liberal, progressive, peace-loving Christians to actually go in groups and attend? Because these churches are also actually hosting, you know, worship services, and some of us are getting close to being vaccinated, but I mean, it would take some organizing, but once we got vaccinated, actually go. I mean, you talk about the, you know, Muslims and the Christians, but out here we have factions of Christians that are on polar opposites on all the issues.
You know, I haven't heard of that specifically, but one of the things that I have heard of a lot is activist groups that have done organizing specifically around some of the clashes in their faiths. So in Turkey, during the Gezi Park uprisings, there was a situation where the police were cracking down on the Muslims while they were praying. So the Christians formed a protective ring around their Muslim fellow protesters. In this case, they were fellow protesters. Or there was a situation where during one of the Muslim holy days, the police had actually massacred a bunch of people. And so right where the blood was running in the street, they literally put down the tablecloth and held a sacred meal for peace. So powerful. But I'm also thinking about the counter-protesters for the Westboro Baptist Church actions. So, you know, with the Westboro
I
Baptist.
organized one of those actually here in Helena before I ever went to seminary, way back around 2000, and organized a response for the churches in town. Was part of that.
Yeah.
Fun.
Yeah. Sometimes when the KKK or the Proud Boys are going to hold a rally, the whole community will come out and hold a rally for love and inclusion that will vastly outnumber the KKK rally, right? This has happened a lot in recent years. But also,
sure
we
that
know
would be the case here. And that's what I mean. It's like trying to figure out what will, because we are so divided, trying to figure out what is actually going to have some kind of a impact to the mindset, to the other mindset, to see things, to get a little crack in the, little chink in the militant, really fascist kind of mindsets that we're dealing with. And we're really, because we can organize the progressive, and we've been doing that in Montana, but we're not, we haven't been able to stop that violence.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing because, sometimes we need to, like, the front line of our struggle in our area is not the same as the front line of the progressive struggle, right? Sometimes our job is actually to de-escalate the rising rhetoric of hate on the within certain factions.
I think
right?
that's what I'm trying to, get a grip on, is how do we, I had this idea when you're talking about and I saw that thing. I live in a subdivision, and we are trying to kind of build a permaculture community around it, but we have Trumpers all over. And we're going to put a sign out in front of our house that says "Love your neighbors" with the scripture referenced out the bottom, rather than having political sign, "Love your neighbor." But when I saw that art installation, I thought, what if we had that on our streets? What if we got out as this neighborhood and painted that on our streets? Love your neighbor.
Go big and bold. Yeah.
Oh, well, I mean, I don't know that's that big and bold. It's where it seems like you can actually reach people. We can't reach our neighbors.
Right.
We have people arrested for fighting over yard plagues in this town last week.
I'm not surprised. Yeah, Kathy, did you have something you wanted to say? I saw you kind of like flash your hand.
Oh, I was reaching, but I was gonna, I can't even remember what it was. I was gonna comment on what she was saying, and then I can't remember what it was. But part of it is you got to be careful when you start painting streets, because in my town in Nebraska, that would get me in big trouble. But you could take another way to do it, though, is to take chalk, the street, the sidewalk chalk, and invite kids to come and do the artwork about love, in your neighborhood, and or take little rocks that you find and paint positive images on them and drop them around in other places around the community, so that it's little, you're spreading the love, positive energy and all that in subtle ways. And you can't get littering for that, because there's a lot of places that even protesting now with the pipelines and stuff, they're passing laws in these communities.
That's what we're dealing with.
And that's what we're doing in Nebraska and stuff too.
The governor gets to appoint judges to the Supreme Court and the district courts, and it's
and that's the scary part. That's what you just reminded me what I was going to say, is that when you have your elected officials spreading the hate and stoking all that you're trying to get people to quit hating, quit people. We got a senator in Nebraska that always talks about, in disparaging ways about Red China. And it's just his whole tone all the time. And, it's just the hate that's always coming from elected officials in our states like that. It's nothing like we had in California, it's just different. You can find your little pockets of love out in certain areas, but it's hard to find those in Montana or Nebraska.
But I think you could get, I'm thinking that maybe I could get sort of like this stealth movement of love your neighbor, where people painted little rocks or folded origami. And
here's the thing, in our community, we have a Be Kind Week or something that all the churches participate in. So that's a way to draw people into what you're trying to do too. Is what about starting a practice kindness week in your community? Because there's nothing controversial about being kind to anybody. So then you're drawing the different churches in, and then you can work from there after you slowly bring, just throwing out ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or you can also choose where to challenge someone. So I'll give you a good example. I grew up in Maine, and Maine's notoriously actually the whitest state in the nation. And they were having a problem where Mainers are actually very standoffish to everybody. But there's been a lot of immigrant populations to Maine lately, and that's been causing a lot of friction for many reasons, including racism. But one of our immigrants started a I Am a Mainer poster campaign where he would paint people who had just immigrated and now made Maine their home. And these posters would go up like, whenever a building was being renovated and they put up the plywood, they would put up the posters on top of that. And, it stirred up so much conversation. It really pushed so many people's buttons, but it was a way of talking about like, what are our common values and how do we see our issues in those lights from that perspective? So if it's Be Kind Week, how do you make sure you're always pushing the envelope so that we're not just being nice, right? We're using our common values to actually redefine an issue that we've been entrenched on that's causing rhetorics of hate or division or fear or animosity. Yeah. So we are coming close to the end of our time together, and I would really love to tell you one last story, which is maybe the best story of mobilization that I've ever heard.
Okay.
Can I have a few extra minutes to do that?
Sure, please.
All right. So this is Otpor's Art Cycle, A-R-T, art. Otpor was a movement in 2000, well, actually 1998 when this started, in Serbia to get rid of their dictator, Slobodan Milosevic. And it was a youth movement, but it actually had its seed in complete disaster. The students had done a university-wide uprising against Milosevic. They had shut down all the universities in Belgrade. They had occupied the universities, and they had completely failed. Nothing had changed. And after that, 12 people got together and said, let's try again, but let's really think through what we're doing this time. And those 12 people started Otpor, which means resist in Serbian. And Otpor did a lot of things right. They had a grand strategy. They really anchored in trainings, but here's how they mobilized from 12 people to 80,000 people in 2 years and ousted their dictator. So first they started with actions, and they would do these really funny actions. This one is called the bang on the can action. And if you can see, there's actually a picture of a target with Milosevic's face on it. And people would have this big stick and they would say, if you're angry at Milosevic, bang on the can. And people would go bang, bang, bang. And of course, everyone would come running to see what was happening, at which point the Otpor activists, this guy in the purple coat, would say, anybody else want to bang on the can? And then bang, 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 and more people would come running and it would keep going. But they didn't just do one-up actions. Every time they did an action, they had a recruitment sheet. Now, in 2000 in the US, not everyone had emails, but definitely in Serbia, email was not really a primary mode of communication at that time. So they used clipboards with this sheet on it for name, telephone number, address. And what you would do is if you came to the bang on the can action is the guy with the clipboard would say, hey, we're Otpor, we do such and such, we're trying to get rid of Milosevic, you want to help us? And the people would sign up their names. That night, they would get a phone call from the Otpor activists saying, hey, I'm glad you're interested in this. We're having a training tomorrow night. Why don't you come? It's after work and we'll all go for drinks afterwards. Now, this is a big training. This was later on. Usually it was like 5 or 6 people tops. And they would have trainings every night of the week on a different thing. And you had to go through 5 nights of training before you could actually join Otpor. And on the first night, you would learn what Otpor was. The second night, you would learn about strategy for nonviolent movements and what Otpor's strategy was. The third night, you would learn, I think, communications and how to make the Otpor symbols, like this clenched fist. And then the fourth night, you would learn how to plan a street action. And the fifth night, you would train to uphold nonviolence at your street action. And then on Saturday, you would have to go out and do a street action, right? Maybe you'd do the bang on the can, but maybe you would put up these posters. Maybe you would, go hand out flyers. Maybe you'd do a demonstration. But everywhere you went, you would actually be, you would have your clipboard and you would sign up more people, and then you would call them that night, and training would start again on Monday. This is their art cycle: action, recruitment, training. And this is how they grew from 12 people to 80,000 people in just 2 years, pre-internet in Serbia. I think this is the most remarkable story of mobilization that I've ever heard. And it's such a clear mechanism. Now, we may not have trainings every night of the week. It may be that we have a training on Wednesday night, let's say. But I think the pattern of doing visibility actions, getting people to sign up, following up, doing an immediate training that leads them to do an action that leads them to sign up more people is a pretty brilliant strategy for mobilization. So I thank you for letting me share it with you. I've never seen it actually written down in many places. I was lucky enough to hang out with that guy in the purple jacket, whose name is Ivan Marovic, and hear him describe this one night. So I'd love to hear from you, just as like a closing for this session. What was one or two ideas that we talked about today that you might go away and actually start working with?
I think I'm going to start on the Be Kind Week.
Love it.
I mean, and just see how people can really push the conversation that we're not so divided. I mean, it's worth a try.
Yeah, for me, building new connections and relationships with individuals and organizations.
I'm kind of, I like the idea of the art, because that's something I've been thinking a lot about lately anyway. And how can we get people involved through creativity that's not controversial? And I also like that trash dragon and the Earth Day parade with Earth Day coming up. That's a good way to get younger kids, really involved anyway, there's just a lot of great ideas coming through. I just appreciate everything you put our way tonight. It's just really like, oh yeah, that's an idea.
The conversation part is right up my alley. I have a passion for it, but this gives me even more inspiration, and I look forward to doing it with Muna. And on the other hand, I typically leave art to others, and this is a reminder that I could even nudge others or invite others or play a role in art. And I also wanted to say, as Santa Cruz, California, and it's amazing to me to hear Kathy and Robin describe your situations in Montana and Nebraska. It's an abstract for me, and you are living every day in an aspect of more difficult situation than I do.
Thank you.
Like the other Peter, art is not my thing either, but I appreciated the moment to reflect on bits of art that have been really impactful that I've seen. But I'm fairly new here, so kind of a lot of my focus is on the conversations and reaching out and just building some of those relationships for deeper work.
Muna, did you get to share something that you'll be thinking about more?
Me, I shared already.
Oh, you did? Okay, sorry.
Yeah, it's okay.
Sorry about that. Yeah. Well, great. So remember that every time you're like that's not my thing, but it should really be included. That is a great opportunity for doing outreach and building participation. You don't have to be Superman and do everything, right? It's your weaknesses are the place to invite people to collaborate, right? And you'll have skills that they need too. So in the chat box, I put 3 really awesome links. The first one is for the Campaign Nonviolence Week of Actions in September. So you have lots of time to think about this. But we're asking people to sign up now and just say, hey, yeah, I think it'd be cool to do something, because then we can follow up with something that's really, really cool, which is a free pass to all the other skill building webinars, which is a perk, a new perk. We've never done this, but we're really glad and happy to offer it. So please do sign up. It's a really exciting and fun week. It's just full of so many amazing people sharing this very complex and beautiful vision. So the second thing you'll find in the chat box is something that we just released called Ideas for Action Week. And it's this massive Google file of all the ways we can take solidarity action and creative action and small actions and large actions to build a culture of peace and active nonviolence. We had a lot of fun putting together this mega list, and you might want to check back from time to time because we're probably going to keep adding to it. So it's a resource. It's pretty amazing to look at. I really enjoy it. The third thing you'll find in the chat box is the next skill building webinar, which is all about getting creative. So we kind of touched on creativity today, but we're going to go really wild with this idea at the next one. I have so many great stories up my sleeve of really phenomenal creative action to share, and bring your stories too, because we'll have space for that. But I want to thank you all for tonight's session. It was a real joy. It was wonderful to hear from you. I'm glad to hear the ways that we're thinking about where our front line of struggle is, what is ours to do, because we're all in different places. But if we all do that thing that is ours to do, we're all helping each other, right? So if Robin is so busy trying to de-escalate that rising hatred that is literally next door to her, she doesn't have time necessarily to work on all those big progressive agenda things.
Well,
But
we
Peter in Santa
we lost
Cruz,
the battle.
right? But Peter in Santa Cruz, you can help advance that, knowing that Robin's doing her work to keep those counter protesters from coming and squelching your movement there, right? So just to remember
They
that
are doing that.
absolutely, especially on the national scene, this is what we see playing out all the time. So respecting each other's work and honoring the ways that we are an ecosystem working together. It really means a lot for me to get to work with people who are doing all these different pieces. And I thank you for being here with me tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Check the follow-up email coming out tomorrow, because I'm going to put like 10 links in there for you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Appreciate your
All
time.
right, good night.
Appreciate you.
Thank you.